for our presenter tonight, I really don't like to go through the bio and read for you. You can all read it. But Shane is one of the most competent engineers that I know, I've been working with. Shane and I were part of the market advisory committee for 10 years, even more, I think, Shane. I was there 10 years and Shane was there as well. And he is not only a really great engineer, but you will see that a great economist with a lot of knowledge about rules and regulation. And the topic that he's covering tonight is going to be very interesting because it's what the WEM, wholesale electricity market, and how it functions and the cost. So without further ado, I ask Shane to come and present, please.
Might leave that down there. I think I can talk loud enough for this room. Thanks, Dean. Just a quick sort of prelude before I jump into this sort of stuff, and there's a fair bit to rattle through today, so I'm going to try and rattle through it as quickly as I can. I suppose, where did this presentation come from? It mostly came from sort of internal, some materials that I've been building internally for my own sort of job, etc. And it was just around noticing what was going on in the market. And one of those things that was, going on in the market is that why are costs exploding like they're exploding? Why is no one talking about it? Or why do people don't think that that's a problem? Why is wind not doing what we thought it was going to do? A bit of background, I've had a lot to do with developing a few wind assets back in the time as well, so I sort of know how that works. And so I sort of started putting all these things together, and I've sent a number of presentations around to a few people already. And what sort of struck me was a few things started to emerge, a few sort of key underlying rationales or reasons started to pop up, and they centered around the market itself. Okay, the market has been around for 20 years now. It started in 2006, and so what I sort of thought is, like I typically do with these sort of things, I sort of take two big steps backs and have a much broader look at why is this happening, what are the fundamentals, rather than basically getting stuck in the weeds and sort of trying to work out what the actual problems were. All right, so that's where this came from. Like I said, there's a fair bit through. I know there's Dean sort of suggested there's a few people that might not have a big market experience, so there's a lot of acronyms in here. I'll try and explain them and go slowly and all that sort of stuff, but a little bit of an understanding of the market is quite helpful in this. Now, I'm sort of like blind up close, but I can see up there, so I'm going to take these glasses on and off all the time. So I'll start this off with a little bit of audience participation. Let's see if this works. Who agrees with these statements? Hands up if you agree that renewable generation produces low or zero short-run marginal cost energy. Yeah, I agree with that. Keep your hands up. That higher amounts of low or zero short-run marginal cost energy delivered into the real-time market will lead to lower prices.
No.
Maybe. Ergo, the more renewables we deliver into the WEM, the lower our delivered cost of energy. All right, there was the trick. All right, cost of energy is not the same. Okay, so let's have a look at these costs. All right, so this is a representation. This is an actual representation of the average delivered electricity cost in the WEM in 2025. We've got networks down the bottom, which is a big cost in this market. We're a very long, skinny networks and not a lot of people, so that's always going to be a big cost. The blue bars are interesting. The first one, the big one, is bilateral energy. Now, this is going to be a really important theme in this discussion. Okay, so bilateral energy is everything that is traded bilaterally outside of the market. It's netted off. We all know that we're a bilateral market here. Okay, and so that is by far and away the biggest one. Then you've got the STEM, the short-term energy market, and the real-time market. The short-term market is a day-ahead market, and the real-time market is obviously the real-time market. And then on top of that, we've got some stuff. We've got the essential system services. We've got non-co-optimized essential system services, market fees, and then capacity. We all know that we're a capacity market here. So just to set out what those costs are. So it's only these cost components that are reduced when you add lots and lots of new cheap renewables into the system. So these are the real-time cost components. And most particularly, it's actually that very light blue, the fluorescent bar on top. which is a tiny proportion of the overall delivered costs. So when everyone on LinkedIn or whatever jumps up and down by saying we reduced the real-time energy price by 10% quarter on quarter, they're talking about that tiny little sliver of energy. But the problem is all of these other costs typically have to go up in order to get that reduction on that tiny sliver of energy. And that's not what we're talking about in this market, or that's not what anyone seems to talk about in this market. So why is this important? That's why. Again, this is actually all real numbers going back to 2015 of the costs by component in this market. And as you can see, those costs are going very, very high. As a matter of fact, they likely, and none of these are my expectations or forecasts. These are actual numbers that I can point to and basically say that's what Western Power needs, that's Synergy standard products, etc., etc. Okay, and when you have a look at that with compared to inflation, it's actually even worse, because for a period of the last decade, we were doing really, really well here. In real terms, our electricity costs of delivery were actually decreasing. But then it got to a point, and that changed quite dramatically. So that's around about 22, 23. So it's not that long ago. Okay, so the problem here is that if we don't, we're in the middle of, if I just go back a bit, we're in the middle of this very, very significant price ramp. Okay, and unfortunately, there's not much we can do about what's coming next, because they're virtually locked in. But if we don't start doing something about this soon, that's unsustainable. You can't go down to the Kwinana Strip or Kemerton or something like that and say to someone, can you operate on those, on the cost of energy is like that? No, they can't. Okay, so someone has to start doing something about this now. So I just wanted to throw that out there as a bit of a precursor. That's sort of the synopsis. That's the problem that we have. So now let's go right back to the beginning. Let's talk about energy markets, all right? Because that's what we have here. So a little bit of history. Why do we have competitive energy markets or electricity markets? I mean, when you think about electricity, governments built electricity systems. Every single electricity system around the world has been built by governments. Most of them are still owned by governments. Okay. However, there are markets that have started to proliferate. So if we go back, I'll rattle through this. We'll do a brief history. I just want to show you a timeline, though. All right, Thomas Edison, Pearl Street Station, etc. DC power station, invention of the transformer, Tesla, Westinghouse, AC transmissions. If we go to the 1920s, okay, so 100 years ago, we start seeing regional utilities developing in the United States. 1924, the Victorian grid, which is basically a line that ran from the Latrobe Valley into Melbourne. Okay, but that's 1924. 1935, the first national grid in the UK formed, effectively. 1940s to 50s, state electricity commissions in Australia were formed. It's not that long ago. 1950s to the 1980s, you started getting interconnectors between states on the east coast, and we basically formed what we call the Swiss here around 1980. 1990s saw the height of neoliberalism. Western economies theorised that privatisation and deregulation would drive competitive efficiency. Now, whether you believe that or not it doesn't matter. Basically, in the 90s, we started putting electricity markets in. Okay, so first of all was the UK, first market, deregulated market. And then 1996, the EU and the United States followed. 1998, the NEM. And then over here in the WEM, in 2006, we finally got our act together, although several years before that it took to put it all together, but we put our market in 2006. Okay, so timeline's important, because I'll get to that. Let's superimpose that timeline now on a chart of generation technologies. Now, of course, if this was absolute generation, we'd start very, very low, and we're using significantly more energy now. But what I wanted to show is at every point, at every snapshot in time, this is what regulators around the world or governments around the world were dealing with. These were the technologies, okay? So characterized by fossil fuels, simple equation, especially in Australia. We don't have any nuclear and minimum hydro, and none over here, of course. Electricity markets were established in this period. So if we have a look at that, that's lots of coal, lots of gas, lots of diesel, all that. But energy transition started here. So a simple question is, who thinks our electricity markets are actually built with the energy transition in mind? Yeah. Spoiler alert, of course they're not. All right, this is where it starts getting a little bit more sort of, technical-ish. Energy market design. So there are many, many ways to do the same thing. So so the types of technologies across jurisdictions can differ. Nuclear, hydro, which we don't have a lot in Australia, etc. Okay, but there's one thing common to all of these markets around the world, and that's the low duration curve, okay? You basically have an annual low duration curve, and you need base load, we all know what that is, coal, nuclear, cogen, mid-merit, peaking, and what I've sort of termed here the ultra peaks, that things, those periods during the year that happen only very, very, very rarely, but you need your capacity online and available to meet it, okay? And so whatever the type of market you want to put in place, there's one thing that all of the markets do, and that is to try and create a daily optimal supply portfolio. Okay, so you've got an annual low duration curve. This is all the energy that we need, and we want a daily optimal supply portfolio. We want to meet that duration curve as efficiently as possible. And this was relatively easy to do in the 90s and early 2000s because technologies were pretty simple. We knew what was going on. And so in the early 2000s in the WEM, we basically had coal and cogen, we had CCGT gas to meet the mid-merit, and we had OCG, open cycle gas turbines, to meet the peaks. The ultra peaks were a little bit harder to meet because if you have a look at that optimal supply portfolio, that synergy supply portfolio, Alinta supply, origin supply portfolio on the East Coast, no one really wants to build a whole bunch of peakers that get turned on once every 10 years. That's not part of your optimal supply portfolio. That's effectively the AMO's job. That's effectively the system manager's job, okay? So it's a lot harder to incentivize the investment in those assets. So in the WEM, of course, we use the reserve capacity mechanism, okay, which is effectively, the way I took a look at that is, it's a socialized insurance mechanism. We socialize that across all of the other, the whole market via the IRCR, the individual reserve capacity requirement, which is actually a really neat solution, okay? It's the cheapest way of doing it. It's the least cost way of doing it. So further on to energy market design, horses for courses. Let's have a look at the type of market that we're designing an energy, the type of system that we're designing a market for. So this is a chart of, it's a cool little chart I put together years and years ago, so I had to update it. It's like complexity, market size, complexity, and so the complexity is the number of participants on the left side, on the y-axis, and the number of facilities on the x-axis. Nord Pool is a bit of an outlier. It's a little bit more of a, there's lots and lots and lots of little facilities, and it's a little bit more of a trading system. But if you have a look, you've got PJM, big market, quite complex. The UK, ERCOT, Texas, CAISO in California. You've got the NEM, there's New Zealand there. That's us. All right? The WEM, by size, is tiny. By complexity, is very, very simple. We know that. There's only a handful. There's Synergies, Alinta, there's even Blue Waters, it doesn't really, it's a wholesaler. There's not a lot of competition in this market. It is a very simple system. All right, so we should design our markets accordingly. So let's have a look at what we had available to us when we put the market design in place. And I'll actually admit now, I wasn't here in 2006 when I came in 2006, so what happened here happened just prior to I came along. So this chart basically shows you, it's effectively the long-term price of domestic coal per gigajoule, domestic gas, and I threw in the seaborne Newcastle coal just as a little bit of something to have a look at. And what we can see here is that these are very, very stable prices for a long period of time, okay? We started our market here. And if you look back, like I said, the SEQA, Western Power, the state, etc., they basically had decades and decades of long, stable access to fairly low-cost energy. All right, that is the fundamentals. That was the basis of, or the parameters that we had in the early 2000s when we designed our market. And the other thing that's really, really important to understand is that at the time that we did design our market, we actually put in a lot of new generation. There was a significant investment of new generation that happened just around about market start. So let's unpick that for a little bit. So Coburn, either side of market start in 2006, so a couple of years either side, we have 1,300 megawatts of effectively baseload and mid-merit generation that came into place. So Coburn, Synergy built, Synergy wasn't there at the time, it was Western Power of course, but someone's going to pick me up there. The two Pinjarra cogen units, Alinta or Babcock and Brown at the time, I think it was Babcock and Brown, they had Nugen Kwinana and Blue Waters.
We put coal just before this.
Sorry?
We put coal just
Just before. I just wanted to, yeah, that's true as 95, 97, something like 96, 99. Okay, not too far away. But I wanted to look at, when the market was actually in development, okay? So when everyone knew that a market was coming in. So if you have a look at what was built at that time, 25% of capacity by the time Blue Waters was finished, 52% of all the energy being consumed was constructed in that one short period of time. Last year, it was actually 43%. So that one big flurry of generation development still was supplying 43% of all the energy that we consume. That's an enormous amount, right? Now, the interesting thing about this is that all of these were bilaterally contracted. They were either bilaterally contracted direct with counterparty to counterparty or within the portfolio of Synergy and Alinta. But the big thing here is that most of them were done by the private sector, all right? And this is exactly what the WEM envisioned, right? Because the WEM is designed as a bilateral market. This is absolutely critical, and no one refers to this anymore, okay? But you've got to keep this in your mind all the way through this presentation. The WEM is a bilateral market. That's how we designed it, because we're small. We saw all the parameters, all the things that make up Western Australia energy sector. We saw what that looked like, and we said, let's do a bilateral market, all right? So what does that look like? That's basically the last, 10 years or so of energy that's been sold in our market. The big blue blob is what's sold bilaterally. Now, this could be anything from Boddington Gold Mine signing a 20-plus year agreement with Blue Waters to provide them electricity for a very, very long time, or it could be someone going on outage and getting a 25-day bilateral agreement with someone to provide them with, hedge energy, et cetera, But the large blue blob is bilateral contract. The dark blue and the fluorescent blue is what's actually traded in the market, okay? So very, very small amounts. 90% of it's still bilaterally contracted. If we then look at all the facilities that were brought into the market, okay? All the facilities in the, since market start. Blue means bilaterally contracted, all right? All of them. So Synergy had its fleet. The Alinta basically in its own portfolio. The wind farms came in, Nugen, Kwinana, bilateral, Blue Waters, Neerabup, until we get to the diesel peakers, which came in on merchant because they're a 1 in 10 year reserve capacity facility. That's what the reserve capacity mechanism is there for, all right? It's there to actually procure something that a bilateral or that a portfolio supplier doesn't want in his portfolio. But this breaks down recently, okay? Because the batteries that have now come in, the best that have come into the system, haven't been bilaterally procured. Why? All right, so we'll get into that. So let's talk a little bit about the capacity mechanism, because everyone loves to talk about it, but I don't think anyone really understands it properly. So remember our link between the duration curve and the optimal supply portfolio, and we want an energy market that is designed to actually give us an efficient optimal supply portfolio. And then we said, who pays for that ultra peaking bit of capacity, that insurance product? All right, we know that we do that via the RCM here, the reserve capacity mechanism. Okay, so let's have a look at how that looks. So back in 2006, this was sort of like our structure of the facilities that we had available to us. Okay, so what this is saying is, if you have a look, so this is a coal plant on the left, has high fixed costs, meaning it's a bloody big machine that you've got to spend a lot of money to build, but it's got a very low variable cost because the price of coal, the cost of coal is quite low, okay? And because you're consuming so much of it, and you're, the dollars per gigajoule, you're basically putting out millions and millions of megawatt hours a year, it's actually a reasonably low variable cost. Combined cycle or even cogen, sort of slightly lower fixed cost, but still quite high, slightly higher variable cost, but still reasonably low. You get to the open cycle gas turbine, it's actually got fairly low fixed costs, okay? But the variable cost is higher. All of these things, as we saw, form part of our optimal supply portfolio. We all want them. That's the cheapest way to meet that daily demand curve, all right? The diesel peaker, however, is different, okay? The diesel peaker has the lowest fixed cost. You don't even have to connect it to a pipeline, all right? But the variable cost is extremely high. I mean, a diesel, what, 30, 40 bucks a gigajoule compared to 6, 7 bucks a gigajoule for gas. So that variable cost is very, very high. So that's basically the fundamentals of what was available to the market. So the reserve capacity price, or the reserve capacity mechanism, is there to cover the fixed cost of that diesel plant. Now, most people know this, but I'm just going to go through it because it's important just to get it in your head. The fixed cost of that diesel plant, which is only running one in 10 years effectively, that's on average what it's meant to be running, okay, and that's the socialised sort of insurance product that we have. The efficient variable pricing or short-run marginal cost bidding means that all that high variable cost, they get that back, it's sort of netted out, so we don't worry about that, okay, and we're only running it 1 in 10 years, we don't care about that price, okay. However, this is where the design of the mechanism comes in. That reserve capacity price is allocated across all capacity. So even these other CCGT or coal plants that have much, much higher fixed costs only gets the reserve capacity price of the lowest facility, of the lowest price facility. So that reserve capacity price doesn't meet the fixed costs of those plants. However, a retailer will contract with them anyway. So a retailer, for example, Synergy contracted with Blue Waters. Synergy was happy to pay Blue Waters a very, very high fixed price, okay, even though the reserve capacity price was very, very low. So Synergy, for a capacity credit, only got compensated a low amount of money, but it paid a high fixed price. Why was it willing to do that? It was willing to do it because it's a bilateral contract. They're interested in the levelised cost of energy, okay? So the levelised cost of energy in a coal plant is low. It forms part of that efficient or optimal supply portfolio, okay? So that's why that's why those retailers are able to enter into long-term agreements with a coal plant, a combined cycle plant, an open cycle gas turbine, all right? Importantly, as we all know, all of those plants are also schedulable generation, okay, which means they serve the purpose of being able to meet the peaks as well. They are on during peak periods, which is why 100 megawatts of a coal plant gets 100 capacity credits, just like the diesel peaker. And so it's this combination of a low levelised cost of energy and a very, very certain, high certainty capacity, peak capacity, that allows the bilateral market to work with the reserve capacity mechanism that we have. All right? I won't go too much longer on this, I'll just sort of finish up quickly. So what is the cost of this insurance premium that effectively the AMO, or the old IMO, is buying? So the market operator procures these facilities to socialise the cost of the insurance product. And because the fixed cost of this facility is the lowest in the system and is applied across all the rest of the capacity in the system, it basically leads to the lowest cost insurance that we can possibly have. And what does that look like? If you have a look at historical numbers, let's take 5,000 megawatts of capacity in the system, around about 18 terawatt hours, about 110,000 bucks a megawatt per year. Everyone remember those prices? That was a long time ago, but anyway. It equates to a long-term sort of, on average, 500, 600 million bucks a year, which if you put that into megawatt hours, dollars per megawatt hour, it's 30, 40 bucks, all right? So of our delivered energy cost, or our delivered energy price, 30 to 40 bucks a megawatt hour is what we pay for the insurance product that means that we shouldn't have blackouts in high peak periods. All right, that's the design. Energy transition doesn't work like that. We want to get rid of these. All right, no more diesel, no more coal. Believe me, I know that. No more, even the combined cycles, all right? They'll be around for a while, but no one wants to build another combined cycle. And we want to replace them with these. All right? So let's have a look now at 2026 and what our reserve capacity structure looks like, the same as we did in 2006. We still have some sunk cost assets here. We have coal and we have combined cycles, and their fixed costs have been reduced now. You know, most of the fixed cost is actually debt repayment, etc. Okay, so they actually are less fixed costs now. The open cycle gas turbines, well, we're still going to have them, and we're actually building more because we sort of know now that we need those for keeping the lights on, etc. So they're still going to be there. But we want to replace the energy producers with wind, and this is proving problematic, as we all know, and I'll get onto that later. Okay, but wind, as you can see, is a very high fixed cost asset because it has virtually no variable cost because the wind's free, as we know. But our big problem at the moment is this one, is BESS. So while BESS provides some very, very good outcomes to the market, it's a unique and interesting technology, its cost structure doesn't fit our market, all right? And it's causing some problems. So what happens when we have a market that's not designed for these asset types? Well, let's look at BESS first, all right? So we'll do the same thing as we did previously. So as we know, we've changed the reserve capacity technology from that diesel peaker, diesel-fired open cycle gas turbine, into a BESS technology. So let's have a look at how that's working for us. Noel will probably get interested here. All right, so BESS is fundamentally different to an open cycle gas turbine. It's not run once every 10 years in a hot period. It's run every day. All right, it's filled up, discharge, filled up, discharge. It is actually run every day. It's a completely different type of technology. All right, it's load shifting, it's doing demand, essential services, etc., etc. And it's not bilaterally. I mean, has any BESS been bilaterally contracted? No. Why has it not been bilaterally contracted? Because it's bloody expensive. Right, BESS is too expensive. So unlike the coal plant, who we would bilaterally contract, even though it's a very, very high fixed cost, but we know the levelized cost of energy out of coal is really, really low, same as combined cycle. That's not the case with BESS. The levelized cost of storage, we don't call it energy because it doesn't produce energy, it stores, but the levelized cost of storage is still high. Now it will come down, and don't get me wrong, BESS will be an extremely important part of any energy system going forward, but right now it isn't, okay? And so unlike the coal plant, we don't have that offset of low energy costs for us to bilaterally contract it. So us clever people, we decided to procure it. We'll use the reserve capacity mechanism. All right, we used NCES originally, which was a bit of a disaster. However, probably a better way of doing it, but I'm not going to go into that today. But we used the reserve capacity mechanism. So what we did is we changed the benchmark technology to the BESS, okay? And what this does, though, is it now socializes the cost of the BESS across everyone. So remember when I had that red line in there and we had the open cycle gas turbine diesel, we're socializing the cost. Every single bit of capacity gets that lowest cost, that lowest reserve capacity price. So now every single bit of capacity is getting the new reserve capacity price, which is for a BESS, which is much higher than the fixed costs of everything else, especially the fixed costs of some sunk cost assets. So what does that look like? So using current round numbers, 6,300 megawatts, still 18 terawatt hours, which is interesting. I'll get onto that. Capacity price of 488,500 equates to a capacity cost of around $3 billion. All right, $170 a megawatt hour. You know, woof. So, people who understand the capacity mechanism know that around about, if this works, around about 2017, 18, I can't remember exactly when it was, there was a transitional energy price offered for capacity. And the reason it was offered is because that was prior to the most recent curve change, etc., and everyone thought the price was going to go to zero because there was an opportunity for the price to go to zero. So everyone thought, I'm going to be conservative and hedge myself. It was a bit of dumb luck, but it's actually now helping us. So that transitional price is much, much lower than the price I just showed you. And so when you bundle them together, this is the actual price. So this is real. These are dollars that we either have experienced or are experiencing, and that they are locked in. Again, if we have a look at that in real terms with regard to inflation, again, we were doing pretty bloody well. Our socialised insurance cost was declining in real terms. But again, you get around to 2022, 2023, and that's really, really turned around now, okay? And it's getting up from 30 to 40 bucks a megawatt hour is the cost of our insurance. In 2020, can't even see that, so 28, it's going to be around about 100, 90 to 100. But the real problem is that when that transitional price expires, we get that 170, 180 bucks a megawatt hour. Most businesses can't operate anything more than $100 a megawatt hour of delivered energy. I'm just talking about the socialised insurance cost, not energy, not networks, not anything else. So this is unsustainable. This is actually untenable. And as a matter of fact, it won't be allowed to occur. It can't be allowed to occur. We've got to shut down Kwinana. All right? So this was easily the biggest mistake we've made in this market. Okay? And it won't be allowed to be made. So there's already a process going on where we're going to either revert back to an open cycle gas turbine or whatever. but this was a self-inflicted wound to us, okay? The problem was no one wanted to buy BESS because it was too expensive. Let's use the RCM. Wrong, okay? That was a problem. So that's BESS. A little aside here, because I found this really interesting. Quick note on the hidden cost of DER. What this chart shows you is actual demand in the market for the last 10 years or so. All right? The green bars is metered demand. The grey is losses, so don't worry too much about losses. The yellow is distributed PV. Okay, so in other words, demand that is behind the meter. Now, demand is growing on a gross basis, but on a net basis, it's basically the same as it was a decade ago. All right, so this is, everyone loves behind the meter PV, it's wonderful. Yeah. Locally, it provides you with a wonderful sort of low cost sort of solution, etc., but it has impacts on the grid. Okay, and when we put behind the meter BESS in, we're actually going to make this even worse because you're going to have more and more electrons that aren't going to escape into the grid. The problem we have is that peak demand continues to grow. All right, and so the result, we're now amortizing the higher cost, the higher peak demand, because it's growing, using the more expensive BESS reserve capacity price, but over the same net demand, over the same megawatt hours, because that hasn't grown. So we'll soon pay 5 times for our socialised cost insurance product. Or put another way, we're going to add $1 billion of real cost to the market a year for the exact same outcome. All right? That's a problem. Real dollars. All right, let's go back to our little wind problem. So, like BESS, wind is very difficult to fit into an optimal supply portfolio. You know, remember my optimal supply portfolio? So that's what we want, the cheapest way to actually meet our customers and our demand. All right? Why is that? Well, to start with, wind's not dispatchable, which basically means you've got a 100 megawatt wind farm, you're not going to get 100 capacity credits, you get about 20, about 20%, okay? So that's a massive amount of revenue that it's missing out on straight away because our market is structured to give you revenue in the capacity system. It has high fixed costs, and so now, rather than get that, as I just said, from the reserve capacity mechanism, it has to recover those fixed costs from variable revenue. But because it's not dispatchable, there's no alignment between the value of its energy and the value of demand energy, okay? Sometimes you get lucky and it's there, and sometimes you don't. All right, so with an open cycle gas turbine, you turn it on when the price is up at $500. You know it's up at $500. With a wind farm, that's not the case. As a matter of fact, when it's really, really, really windy, the price is normally going down because there's excess energy, so you're negatively correlated. So that's a problem for it. So it can't get its fixed cost through the reserve capacity mechanism, and the variable energy price is actually working against it. And because we have to overbuild wind, because we all know, you turn scheduled generation on, you can count on it. Wind, we'll probably need 1, 2, 2.5 wind farms for every equivalent scheduled generation. So because we have to overbuild it, there are necessarily going to be times when we need to spill that energy, okay? And that's foregone revenue, so that's another opportunity for it to recoup its costs gone. If it was cheap energy, we could live with that, but it's not, all right? So what happened to wind? Wasn't wind the next big thing, all right? Well, what happened is that the costs went up. So here we have the CSIRO gen cost. I absolutely searched everywhere to try and get one that went back before 2015, because wind is one of those wonderful things that has just been going downward trend for decades. All right, not just for a few years, for decades. And so then in 2020, costs went up. All right, 35% according to CSIRO 2022-23, and then a little bit more. It's finally starting to come down. What happened? Well, COVID happened, Ukraine happened, Hormuz happened, lots of things happened. So first, the cost of components, little Vestas wind turbine prices on the downward trajectory, boom, up they went again. Anyone trying to build a wind farm around 2019, 20, 21, 22, 23 absolutely understood the impact that this had on prices. And then the cost of capital went up. This is big, all right? People don't think about it much. This is a big issue. And that's, again, a massive downward trajectory, and they went up. And of course, what happened then is that the price of wind farms went up. The PPA prices went up. So again, if you have a look, the downward trajectory of all the PPAs of wind farms being struck in Australia was going down, 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 till around about that beautiful inflection point around about 2019, 2020, I think Stockyard Hill was just before that. It was about 50 bucks, thereabouts. Cooper's Gap in South Australia, $47 or something like that. Holy cow, that's cheap energy, you know? So when that's happening, everything's good. And the double whammy is revenue created, all right? This is the LGC spot price, okay? So the Renewable Energy Target, as we know, was created, was a legislation that created a revenue stream. Very different to the CIS. It created a revenue stream that you could bank on. It was like a very, very deep, fungible sort of market for renewable energy certificates, okay? And that actually made a large proportion of the revenue of a wind farm. But that legislation terminates in 2030, nothing else has been added to it, and so effectively that's gone to zero, right? So that's a large revenue hit. So the costs have gone up and the revenue available to a wind farm has created. All right, let's have a look at how that basically impacts a few wind farms. Now, I was going to make this a really, really streamlined slide, but it didn't work very well because you have to explain everything through. So these are rough numbers. If anyone's out there developing wind farms and you want to have a go at me for saying that that's wrong, then come and do it afterwards. But I've got the controller, so I'm doing it. So all right, let's have a look. In 2019, 2020, 3 large wind farms were built north of Perth, and I got some personal experience with these ones because I was very involved in Badgingarra. So at Badgingarra, Yandon and Warradargi, okay? So let's look at a hypothetical 200 megawatt wind farm. Capacity factor 45%, thereabouts. You got an output, give them a 5% curtailment. Not a heck of a lot of curtailment up there at this time. So the annualized costs of these things. So at the time, the capex was around about 2.2 million a megawatt. Do a nice high debt split, high geared. Very, very low cost finance, 4%. Woof, you're not going to get that again for a while, okay? Equity returns, about 9% at the time, I would imagine is reasonable. And then the rest networks, fixed O&M overheads, such as a bunch of fixed costs, okay? So the total, these are all annualized figures, meeting your debt and equity returns, etc. The annualized cost that this thing required, or the annualized amount of money that required to repay debt and to make a return was around about $52 million. All right, divide that by the amount of megawatt hours we have, around about 60 odd to 70 bucks a megawatt hour, which I think is around about what those wind farms sold in the market for. Okay? All right, let's have a look at the revenue side. Capacity credits, we only get 20%, no, not a lot, 200,000 bucks a megawatt for capacity around about that time. LGC price, $30. That was around about the middle of that LGC sort of chart that I showed you. That's a big chunk of revenue that it's getting. And the energy price, effectively the energy value. These things don't go into the merchant market, but this is the energy value to someone who's buying a PPA. At the time in 2020, 45 bucks a megawatt hour. Whew, remember those days? 33 million bucks, okay? So in other words, if you look at that, there is value in that PPA. That's why they sold. That's why Badgingarra sold. It's why Lindsay built, Yandon. It's why Warradargi was built, all right? Let's have a look today. 2030 wind economics. So in other words, if we want to build wind farms, start now, and we're going to have them in 2030. We're going to have about 1 gigawatt sort of going up in Perth, and we've all seen the announcements about ones that are happening. So let's have a look at a hypothetical 400 megawatt wind farm, which is about the size we're looking at now. I'll be generous and give them a 50% capacity factor. Okay, so we've got an output. I'm not going to be generous. I'm going to curtail them at 20%. Why am I curtailing them at 20%? Because we have to overbuild these things. If we're going to get rid of all of our coal units, we have to overbuild the wind farms, which means we have to curtail them. All right? So a curtailed megawatt hour of wind is 0. You don't get anything for it, so you've got to account for it. So let's have a look at our annualized cost now. The capex, 3.5 million bucks a megawatt. All right? That is expensive. I'll keep the same debt and equity ratio. However, the debt now is around about 7%. All right? That's not 4%. It makes a big difference. Equity returns, let's call it 11%. Everything's gone up. I don't want to make 9% if my debt's 7%. All right? Networks, fixed O&M, overheads, I've just kept all that the same, just scaled it by the 400 megawatts. So now my total annualized cost that I need to be making in the market or making in some form of a contract is around about $176 million. So if we put that into a PPA price, we're talking about 125 bucks a megawatt hour. All right? That's very, very different to what it was before. All right, let's have a look at our revenue stack. Capacity credits, 350,000 bucks a megawatt. All right, so I'm going to be generous here. Capacity's gone up. So you still only get 20%, so 80 capacity credits. The LGC price is zip, it's gone. All right, I'll give you $2. Maybe there's a voluntary market. We'll give a couple of million bucks there. And the energy prices, so even in last year's, I'll use last year's average market energy prices, $85 a megawatt hour. Okay, obvious problem there, isn't there? All right, why would you enter into a PPA with that wind farm? The value you are getting is by far lower than what that guy needs in a PPA to actually bank that facility. The other problem we have is that the biggest component of that is actually the energy. But as I sort of said before, the more wind you put on, when it's windy, when you are producing, you're putting the price down. So in other words, you're cannibalizing your own market. Right? So the biggest component of the value that you've got there is actually the riskiest value you have as well. That's why no one's building wind farms. That's why no one's contracting wind farms. Well, there's a couple being built, but they've been built for different reasons. So I actually put all this in the investment certainty working group because it's a big thing going on at the moment, but then I realised that probably no one in this room knows what's going on. So I'll try and explain it. The investment certainty working group is going on at the moment, which basically says everything that I just told you. They go, oh crap, we can't build wind farms. How do we get wind into the system without just having the government tell Synergy to go and buy them? Okay, how do we get them into the system? All right, and this is back to how does our market work, all right? So what we're doing, what is going on at the moment, and I literally just saw something come through recently that sort of crystallizes on one particular form, but I won't go into it here. But there's a bunch of different things that we can do. We can have minimum prices, we can have a renewables-based benchmark reserve capacity price, so a whole new reserve capacity mechanism for renewables. We can fix that for 10 years perhaps. In other words, we're trying to give some certainty for these guys to come into the market. So what do all these things have in common that's different to the way our market works at the moment? It's that what it's doing is it's basically saying it's applying the fixed costs of that wind farm that it needs to recover across all the market as a fixed cost, or as basically a fixed cost rather than a variable cost. Okay? So irrespective of whether a customer wants to pay for that, irrespective if that price is too high for them to actually bear, the market, in other words, the operator, is saying, I'm happy to bring that in and just smear that across you. So in other words, your prices are going to go up. But and then what about the guy who's actually already self-contracted? So if, I use Boddington because it's the biggest load in the system. They've sorted themselves out for 20 years. They don't want more fixed costs in the market. They're actually paying for their energy already. So how do you basically manage that? There are ways to do it, but what I'm showing you is that the way the market structure is currently designed is not designed to do this. Yet here we are on the cusp of literally doing it. So recap our optimal supply portfolio. I keep mentioning it. I mention it because it's bloody important. So the market design requires this, but in a net zero world, or close enough, gas is still really important. So we realise that. We can't get rid of gas, okay? And we're actually building more gas units. But we're getting rid of the ultra peakers, the diesel peakers. All right, we're getting rid of the mid-merits, et cetera, and we're trying to use storage as that sort of go-between. So storage has been used as a daytime sponge, as a peak shaver, as all sorts of stuff. So our optimal supply portfolio becomes what I've termed an average supply product. I mean, it's not optimal anymore, it's what you get on the day, all right? You've got storage trying to store stuff, you've got wind, you've got excess wind, et cetera, et cetera. And so, again, because we need to build more wind than the system actually needs on a capacity basis, because sometimes it's there and sometimes it's not, then we spill all of this wind. So we either have to overbuild lots of BESS or lots of wind. And we've just gone through a couple of slides that says both of those are really blooming expensive. Okay, so they can't compete at the moment with the sunk cost thermal generation. So what that means is that we're going to be in this scenario of this sort of loop of they're not going to be bilaterally contracted because the sunk cost generation is cheaper and these things aren't part of my optimal supply portfolio. So what does that mean? That means the retailer is left with this. Okay, that's their portfolio. They probably have some contracts, legacy contracts with renewables. They will still contract with gas. And the reason I've got gas looking like that is that, you know, storage is going to meet the peaks and stuff. Sometimes storage isn't there when you use gas. And then you're going to have periods where you just got nothing and you just run the gas flat out. So, you know, I try to make it look like that. So that's what the retailers, that's what the retailer has control of now. But all of this is now part of is being bought in by the market through mechanisms. Again, our optimal supply portfolio that our original market was designed to incentivize is gone. It's not there anymore, okay? That's what we're heading towards. So what's the impact of these changes? Recall our cost component curve here. All right, so this is all the costs without the retail margin. So let's get rid of network costs because networks are networks, all right? Energy, all right? These are the direct energy costs, real-time demand, all right? We all know that. So that's basically in real time, you need energy, you buy it from the market or you bilaterally contract it. That's fairly easy. These ones are all the fixed costs, okay? So these are user pay mechanisms that basically either make you pay for capacity, make you pay for essential services, make you pay for market fees, etc., okay? If we add another effectively fixed cost to bring in not capacity, but the energy that a wind produces, all right, that changes the game. Because now what we're doing is we're having another fixed cost into this system that's getting rid of our incentive to bilaterally contract. All right, so why would you, Dean, go out and bilaterally contract with someone when you know the market is going to effectively pay a wind farm to come in and spill all its energy into the grid? You wouldn't do it, okay? So again, it's a death knell for our bilateral market. It's actually a sort of a death spiral, I suppose you can call. Oh, I actually got it in there. Turns the bilateral market on its head. All right, so where do we go from here? What problem are we trying to solve? Do we have a reserve capacity problem? Do we have a wind problem? Do we have a BESS problem? It's like, no. What we actually have is a basic procurement problem. It's pretty simple, all right? We look at this from a market perspective saying, oh, we can't get this BESS in, we can't do this, what's this? We actually have a procurement problem. If you recall, at the beginning of the market, we brought in all of these 1,300 megawatts worth of thermal generation that's still providing nearly 50% of the energy that we use today, all right? That was all procured bilaterally. So we face a similar generation investment requirement today. So what does that look like? Let's have a look. Now, these things are notoriously hard to get, so actual forecasts that you're not breaking any sort of legal requirements, etc. So I nicked this one out of the AMO GSU last year, okay? So it was actually, this is a public one, but if anyone's seen Aurora and Baringa and all those things, they're very, very similar. So what this is telling us is, going forward, I've got that to 2036, we're going to need a bunch of wind and we're going to need a bunch of BESS. Forget about, sorry, I was meant to say right at the very beginning, I deliberately have left solar out of this equation because this is complicated enough, and when you add solar, it gets much, much, much worse, and we don't have enough time and I don't have enough brain cells for it. But so we need a lot of wind and a lot of BESS. So if we have a look in that same report and have a look at the capital capex figures going for the next 10 years, we can work out that that's going to need around about $22 billion worth of investment over the next 10 years. Okay, and that's not including transmission, not including the gas we need to put in, it's not including the spinning, the synchronous condensers or whatever the else we're going to need to put in as well. All that aside, okay, this is just wind and BESS, all right? $22 billion. So 20 years after our previous large-scale build-out, we need to replicate this investment. But wind and BESS can't be bought under bilateral contract. We've sort of established that. So government's been forced to intervene, all right? Synergy's been directed to buy wind farms under PPAs. Now, unpick that for a second. What that means is that Synergy is signing uncommercial contracts and subsidising wind farms. All right? Now, there's nothing wrong with a government saying to do that. But when you put yourself in the situation where you retired all your coal assets or you're about to retire all your coal assets and you find that the wind that's going to replace it is too expensive and no one wants to buy it, you're sort of stuck. There's nothing else you can do. Okay, so that's the only trick they have left in the book, which is why I said before with the Renewable Investment Working Group, they're trying to find another mechanism to bring that in, even though that mechanism is going against the whole bilateral market. So we're stuck. And the other one is that EPWA is effectively changing the rules and telling AMO that we have to buy BESS via the reserve capacity mechanism, all right, which we just saw that was probably the worst mistake that we've made in this market. Okay, but they're government interventions. Not markets, that's government basically intervening. Now, we hear all the time that, it's a wonderful thing that governments still own Synergy and they still own Western Power, and it actually is. Actually is really, really good. It means we can actually use that, and we should. But that's starting to sound like a single buyer to me, right? Because no one else is out there contracting with anyone. It's one entity, it's effectively government. doing it via a couple of different mechanisms, or not mechanisms, do a couple of different types or different scenarios, either telling Synergy to do it, telling Water Corp to do it, or telling Airport to basically say, go tell AMO to do it. You know, so in other words, we're buying things in that manner. So we can keep chasing the tail of the energy transition by adding layers and layers of complexity to our market. All right, so this is just in the last couple of years. We've got a new flexible product, we got a new price curve which came on top of the old new price curve, and then we had a 10-year reserve capacity guarantee. I couldn't believe that the other day. I found out, I must have been daydreaming or something because I missed it completely, and someone said, oh, do you know that AGL, Perth Energy, got a 10-year deal? I was like, what? It's a gas plant. How did they get a 10-year deal? If that's not procurement, then what the hell is? That's the AMO procuring a gas plant. Okay? Anyway, a new benchmark reserved capacity technology to bring in BESS, an NCAS to bring in BESS, a new renewable mechanism to bring in wind. We can keep adding mechanisms to our market that is now dysfunctional and not fit for purpose, or we can move to a single buyer model. We're mostly there already. Okay? We are mostly there already. We're actually buying things in the market, except we're doing it in a really, really inefficient way. So to my mind, this is tinkering with a neoliberal market that was designed in a different era. This is reforming a market that basically will, you know, give us an ability to keep up with the rapid pace of change. And the fact that the government owns everything here means it's not that hard to do. All right? So we're making what was a simple market very complex. Do we think the growing complexity will end here? I mean, it's 2026. All of those little dots that came in before were basically, in the last 5 years, we've had 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 changes to the market. If you're going to tell me that we're not going to have 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 changes to the market in the next 5 years, then I don't know what you're talking about. So, oh no, there's no volume. Simplify, man. Simplify the market. All right, I'm going to bring this home, wrap it up, been here too long. We implemented a simple market for simple times. Those times change with the energy transition. Actually, there's 37 slides in one here. The market became unfit for purpose and the costs have spiraled. So we can continue down the rabbit hole, tinkering with our market to manage a procurement problem. Or we can implement a new simplified structure that gives us at least 20 years worth of trying to get through this transition. And that's the end. Thank you. More than happy for questions, queries, no fruit.
Yeah. Thanks very much. It was very, very informative. Could you just go back to slide 19, please? I've got a couple of questions in relation to that.
It's slide 19.
Yeah, Ian Porter's money.
Saying slide 19.
What, just in there?
19.
There you go.
Here we go.
Oh, there you go.
Without the
Yeah, this one? Yep.
Yeah. Okay, so considering the gas, OCGT gas will be used in the future as the transition progresses. There'll be a lot more solar, a lot more wind into the system. Renewables uptake will happen. That fixed cost will have to remain for the Dunkelflag when there's no sun and no wind. So the high variable cost then becomes the question: how often are those units actually running for? And more particularly, are they used in such as essential system services with synchro self-shifting clutches, etc., running them as synchronous condensers? Because if they are, they will use about 60% of the fuel that they would use if they're running at full power. That's the nature of the gas turbine. The no-load running cost is extremely high. So if they're going to use them for essential system services, that's going to be a cost they'll have to factor. Is it factored in these numbers?
So,
and what is the quantum of energy we're talking about in that $120 a megawatt? The second question I've got is in relation to the variable cost on BESS. What is that all about? I don't understand that.
Basically filling and discharging the BESS. You got 20% loss on
Losses, yeah.
losses.
Oh, you
fill
mean
it.
losses?
Yeah,
Oh,
you've got
that's
losses,
losses.
but you also have to fill it with something, and you've got to buy from the market and fill it. So there is actually a very
But that's a
cost.
positive, because they're buying when it's cheap and selling when it's high.
Ah, no, they're not.
Yeah, but they're still buying energy. Someone still has to produce the energy. Look, there's
There's a cost, but the cost is the reverse of, you know,
I think
what
that
is it?
I think that'll be factored in your $200. So basically the difference is your revenue.
All right.
You see what I mean? So
Yeah.
I think it's all factored in.
Yeah.
It's just a
Sorry, I'm not an economist.
yeah. And look, and the thing is, in my view, in 10 years' time, BESS is probably going to be so cheap, or whether it's BESS, whether it's lithium ion with sodium ion, whatever we've got out there, it's going to be so cheap that you're going to have a lot of it out there anyway. What annoys me, the way that we've gone about this, is that we locked ourselves into a pathway, into a timeline, for no good reason other than politically it sounded good, okay? All right, yep, we've got to get rid of emissions, all right? Do we have to do it by 2030? Not necessarily. But when you don't plan for the future properly, okay? When you basically say, oh, you can build a transmission line, no, you can't. It's like 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years to do something like that. So when you don't do that properly, you find yourself in a situation where you're forced to make decisions. You're forced to bring this BESS in, okay, at that cost. Now, there's two things here. One, so we're a small system. We've got lots and lots of solar. We needed BESS. We knew that back then in 2017. Remember at the MAC? We were sitting there going, hey, we need. You said I'll pay someone to actually mop up this daytime demand, okay, or this daytime solar. So we knew that a long, long time ago. Yet we didn't do anything about it. Okay, the NCAS was brought in. It was a terrible process because it was extraordinarily lucrative to people to come in. But at the end of the day, the NCAS was actually a bilateral procurement. It's probably the best way to do it. It's just that it should have been done in a much, much, much more structured way. It's why everyone else does it. Everyone goes out to tender. In New South Wales, in Victoria, you know, they go out to tender and basically people come in and say, here, I've got all these wonderful BESS. Could you imagine doing that? Go out and say, I need 500 megawatts of BESS. All right, Neoen, even Synergy, or whoever wants to come in and actually tender for that BESS, and you take the BESS 500 megawatts, and you got 500 megawatts worth of BESS cost. No, we decided to use a mechanism rather than a bilateral, rather than a procurement. That mechanism had brought in 1,500 megawatts of BESS. We've got nothing to fill them yet. Okay, now don't get me wrong. In the future, BESS is going to be extraordinarily important. Solar is going to be extraordinarily important. It's going to be cheaper as well. We just and we got unlucky. COVID happened. You know, Ukraine happened. Wind was 45, 50 bucks on the East Coast in 2019, 2020, and now it's 100, 110. Okay, so, but the problem is here is that we didn't give ourselves any off-ramp. We made decisions, locked ourselves into a pathway, and now we have no choice. If we're going to get rid of coal and we're going to get rid of 5 terawatt hours in this market, you have to replace it. Otherwise, you tell Kwinana Strip to pack up and go home. All right, so basically that's where we are. That's the situation we're in. And what I was trying to sort of say with a lot of this is, you know, A, decisions, you know, poor decisions lead to poor outcomes. B, the market design is leading to poor outcomes. Okay, we could have gone out and bought 500 megawatts of BESS, which is what we need, and it would have been a minimal cost. All right, but we haven't. We've gone out and we've got a mechanism that's brought so much more in at additional cost, and then we made the absolute cardinal sin of basically saying, let's use the RCM and basically push that across all other bits of capacity in the market, which is going to lead to this huge, as Noel puts, windfall gains to other generators, which everyone's going to pay in the order of about $1 billion a year of additional cost for no extra benefit. They're mistakes.
But with respect, BESS is not LDES. And you're not going
No,
to
it's not LDS. No.
So that has to be gas under the current
Yeah, well, that's what that seems to be where
generation,
we're
at
going
least,
here.
not necessarily much fuel usage, but
Yes.
Very interesting. Thank you very much. In 2024, when, as you say, there was a political overlay on the planning of the future, and it was decided that by 2031, now 2031, all of the coal plant would be removed, 1,570 megawatts out, retired. What fell off the rails at that point was there was no plan with which to replace it, other than the light on the hill about solar and wind and batteries. You in that presentation had a system load generation curve, or load curve, and a generation load duration curve. You had those up there, and you showed at the medium level of the generation curve a swag of gas being used, which is going to increasingly come down as the coal is retired, and B is going to get larger due to the intermittency of the incoming devices. And the problem that I perceive in all of this is that we can't get the gas. So the gas pipeline, which has a capacity of around about, let's say for power generation, 400 and something terajoules a day, maximum capacity. By 2031, in order to keep the lights on, after the demise of the coal, we'll be being required to produce, operate at loads of over 20 to 22 terajoules per half hour, or 1100 terajoules a day average flow rates, or daily flow rates. It can only do 400. That's it. And there is no provision, you haven't made any provision in here yet for anything to do with the DBP and the supply of fuel.
That's correct. And so that's just another one of the planning missteps.
Yeah.
I mean, you, again, if you wanted, there is no problem with taking, I mean, most of you guys are engineers. I mean, you can do anything you want if you want to spend enough money, right? And clearly we're spending a lot of money because the prices are going through the roof. So again, that's something else that's going to have to be, it's just going to have to be addressed. It's going to have to be addressed at massive cost.
Exactly.
Okay? So it's just, again, it's one of those things that don't make a plan for the future unless you understand what it is you're doing. Now, one thing I will sort of, how did that go off? Let me just see if I can put this down. There it is.
There it is.
There it is. Okay. This fascinates me. All right. So when the decisions were made in 2022 to get rid of coal, you have a look. Sorry, 22. Yes. Have a look at that green net energy. Actually, it was going down. Actually, there's a better. There's a. If I go all the way back to. Probably these things are.
That one there.
No, the bilateral contract with bilateral market. There. Have a look at the actual 18 terawatt hours being sold in 2015, 2016. In 2022, 17.5 terawatt hours. We were decreasing our actual net demand. It was actually quite, I wouldn't say simplistic, but it was reasonable for someone to say, my demand's decreasing. I can afford, this is a time where I can afford to get rid of all that generation. Of course, demand wasn't decreasing, it was behind the meter was going on.
Yep.
And we also, that was the time that we all should have understood that electrification was going to start happening and decarbonisation was going to start happening, et cetera, et cetera. All right, we haven't even talked about data centres or anything like that, but it's interesting in this market. Just the other thing that whenever I'm talking to people about understanding this market is understand we are tiny, all right? Tiny market, small things can shift the dial. Large things can completely destroy it. Basically around 2022 or thereabouts is when Woodside came out. Woodside came out and said they were going to build H2 Perth, 3,000 megawatt hydrogen electrolyzers in Kwinana. It's like, no, you're not. It's actually impossible to do. The whole system averages 3,000 megawatts. That's just silly, okay? And so, but effectively we have this every periodically, you know. So 2021, 22, 23, hydrogen. It was hydrogen. We were going to have 100 gigawatts worth of hydrogen, etc. Now it's going to be data centres. Cast your mind back 15, 16, 17 years. It was magnetite.
Not at those energy prices, you won't have data centres.
No. Well, no. So, but magnetite as well. So what I'm saying here is that we actually also have to understand we're a tiny, tiny market. You can't just basically say, I'm going to get this new load or demand source or demand and basically say, let's plonk it here and I'll double the size of this energy system. All right? If you're going to do something like that, take it like some of the other guys have looked at before and sort of say up in the Pilbara or off somewhere else and just do your own sort of self-contained system. Because if you're going to do something like that, then just get the WEM design and just throw it in the bin because it's not working at the moment. It just can't sort of work in those sort of circumstances. But anyway, so the point being though is that We still have to face the gas problem. Yep.
Yep.
And I know you make the point regularly, and no one listens to it. I'm sure they do, but you know what? People listen to it and just go, oh shit, yeah, we'll have to deal with that at some point in the future. And it will become a problem, and it will become a cost.
But we've got an access arrangement which is fixed until 2030,
Yeah. Okay.
right?
So-
They don't have to do anything till then.
So look, I mean, so basically, I suppose the point there is that we've made these decisions. We are where we are. You can have a discussion about 10 different sort of problems or areas where we've got problems in the market. What I was trying to talk about here is that, to my mind, I've been saying this for a number of years now, our market design has come to the end of its road.
Yep, agree.
It was a bilateral design. It was simple. I always try to come up with sort of metaphors or sort of, to make things easy for people who aren't in the energy sector. And I sort of thought the best way of looking at this is, we had a sprint car. We designed a sprint car for a 100-metre track. And it was simple. It worked, right? No problem. We now have water traps. We have bogs. We have hills. We have mountains. We need a four-wheel drive, maybe a hybrid four-wheel drive or something. But we need something different. But what we're doing is we're saying, shit, let's stick big fat tyres on the sprint car. Let's put in an extra, long range. Lift it. Let's put a long range tank in. It's not fit for purpose anymore, and we've got to recognise that. We don't have to. We can still go down the rabbit hole, which if I'm going to have a sort of a punt at what's going to happen in the future. That's what we're going to do. We're going to keep the market that we've got, and we're going to keep throwing mechanisms at it. And it's going to be a situation where, we're going to change the reserve capacity mechanism back to a open cycle gas turbine. Okay. So if you've just built, or you're in the process and got FID, or in the process of building a BESS, and you're thinking you're going to get 450, 500,000 bucks a megawatt for the next 10 years, you're in for a bit of a shock. And the problem, and that's not something that should be controversial, because when you see that, and that's unsustainable, and that's locked in, there's not many ways you can stop that from occurring. One of the ways is you can impair capital, right? But the problem now is that if you've just invested into our market and we impair your capital, there's no right answer here. The next investor says, "Oh, I'm not doing that." But if you don't impair the capital, then the loads have to bear it. Yeah. Okay, so we're in a bit of a pickle.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so really, I mean, the way I see it is the state government directing Synergy to enter into those contracts is effectively subsidising energy for everyone. Now, state government subsidised Synergy to subsidise our bills at our homes for a long, long, long time now. We're all quite happy about that. That's one thing. This next step actually takes that to another level. This is basically now saying, I'm subsidising energy for everyone on a mass basis because it's gotten too expensive for my industry to actually operate. Okay? Now again, it's the only thing that we can do because we've got ourselves in this situation. But that's a taxpayer expense. How many hospitals, how many coppers, all that sort of stuff. So in other words, they're poor outcomes. All right, there's no good outcome coming here, but it's just a matter of deciding which one, which outcome you want to pursue. And unfortunately, the government's in a tough position.
Of their own making.
Yeah, their own making, but you can point fingers, or you can try and point fingers. It's a lot easier. Or you can try and sort it out.
Unfortunately, there's not a good story beyond 2030 by the looks of it, because there's some costs for done and they're amortized over 50 years for transmission.
Look, that's a really good. I mean, transmission's one thing, and no one's actually sorted out the transmission yet. We're building Clean Energy Link North, as far as I know, it's just been put over the asset base. All right, but all the other bits of transmission that's meant to be in the future, I don't think we actually have a payment mechanisms.
The Clean Energy Link North's cheap because it's really just energising the 330 line that was already built 10 years ago.
Should be cheap, but it's actually not that cheap even now. But okay, so transmission's one thing. The thing that annoys me is that we didn't need, if we were smart about this, not smart, if we gave ourselves optionality, we didn't need to lock ourselves into building wind farms at the highest price they've been in 20 years. We didn't need to lock ourselves, we didn't lock ourselves in. We didn't need to have a mechanism to procure 1,000 megawatts more of BESS at the prices that they are, where in 5 years' time they'll be half that. Okay? So it's just missteps. And we're a small market, we can't afford to make missteps. Like I said, small things move the dial.
Excellent.
Very good, thank you.
I hope everybody enjoyed this talk as much as I did. A lot of things to think about. Thank you so much, Shane. I think this was the best presentation we had. Thank you. Cheers.